As we said, we'll start with the topic of judicial reform and the division that it's causing in Israel. What are your thoughts on the legitimacy of the judicial reform, but also on the subsequent unrest that is caused within Israel? On the one hand, the current government rules with a coalition of 64. And it can be argued that the losing political side in the general election does have an obligation to respect the will of the people. Yet we know it has also been claimed that the finer details of a judicial reform were not specified in any coalition agreement. And above all, is it really worth the unrest that it has caused, both in Israel and on the international stage?
I defer first and foremost to the ambassador.
I grew up, I apologize, yes, but I grew up in Habonim. And I have many...
Happens in the best families.
Yes. I have many close friends who every Motzei Shabbat are out there demonstrating against judicial reform. And they firmly, sincerely, honestly believe that this is the beginning and the end of Israeli democracy. And it's not, in my opinion, this or that specific proposal, because the truth is a lot of the proposals were proposed by people who are now in the opposition, people like Gideon Saar, people like Lieberman, right? They are worried about, to use their language, not mine, they talk about a Jewish Khomeiniism. Yes, they look at this government and they see people who don't represent what they would argue is traditional Zionist values. They see religious extremism, either the Shas and Aguda type, the Haredi sort of extremism, or they see, in the Mizrachi world, they don't see people like Yosef Burg or Zvulun Hammer. They see Ben Gvir and Smotrich, who they think is something very different. Something more radical, something maybe more fundamentalist. And there's a big group of Israeli people, right, who live in fear that someone is stealing their Jewish state. Maybe you know people like that. On the other side, you've got people, as you said, Rabbi, very truly, they said, well, look, we won the election. What's democracy all about? Maybe the specifics of judicial reform weren't detailed, but the fact that we wanted a judicial reform, everyone knew that. It was part of the party program. It was part of, not just of the Likud, of the Tzionut Datit as well. It was mentioned, it was said, this is one of the objectives if we gain office. And we got a majority. And democracy, as you said, is about respecting the rights of the minority, but also respecting the rights of the majority. Now, government was elected with 64 members of Knesset who wanted to push through judicial reform. And there are a lot of very serious people in Israel. If I speak for too long, you tell me to shut up, yeah? A lot of very serious people in Israel who believe that judicial reform is long overdue. And they say you're supposed to have the separation of powers. But in Israel, you have a judiciary that reigns supreme over the executive and the legislative branches. And you've got to create a new equilibrium, you've got to create a new relationship between the different branches, because the way the current setup is, according to this view, that you can't have a situation where an unelected judiciary makes all the important decisions and the politicians are irrelevant. And we've got to change the way we choose our judges, and we've got to decide where judges can interfere or not interfere. Now, so far, despite all the talk, the only piece of judicial reform that has been passed into law, and now the Supreme Court will meet next month to decide if it's constitutional or not, and that's very interesting in itself, because the justices have to vote, have to decide if it's the bill that limited their power is now going to them, right? And they will decide if it's constitutional to limit their own power, which is an interesting question, yes? I think from any point of view, right? Can a judge Right? It's a serious constitutional question. A judge has to decide if it's right that the legislative has limited his power. I don't know a lot of people who agree to voluntarily give up their power. Maybe you do, but I don't. But having said that, the only bill that's been passed so far is on the reasonableness bill. The Supreme Court in Israel has been able to rule government decisions and legislation as unconstitutional because it was unreasonable, not because it contradicted another law, but in the eyes of the judges, it was unreasonable. And I think there's a fair discussion that even people who are against the judicial reform is if something is not illegal but is unreasonable, is that a reason? Because what's reasonable to Mark might be unreasonable to the rabbi and reasonable to Danny Lamb. What's reasonable? It's very subjective. And if it's not based in law, should the justices be able to... Yeah. But here, because I'm speaking at Mizrachi, I'll just say one more thing. If we want to talk about legal reform in Israel, maybe she would also be talking about the Beit Din, Rabbanim, and how that works. Maybe that's one of the areas where we should be placing a lot of emphasis, because we know what goes, unfortunately, how judges are chosen and so forth, right? There are a lot of issues that Israel needs reform. The current reform, I think Netanyahu, if he was sitting here quietly and talking just to, two people, he'd probably say it's been done wrong, right? What has been done so far? What will happen in the future, I don't know, but I do know this. Close to between just under 2/3 of Israelis, according to polls, support judicial reform with consensus. Will that be possible or not? I don't know.
Thank you, Ambassador. Rabbi Perez, would you like to talk maybe about the impact that it's had on society?
Yeah. I listen very closely to a lot of the people who've been involved in these talks of trying to create some type of consensus. One of them is Micha Goodman. You might know Dr. Micha Goodman, but there are many others. And he says every attempt that has been had ultimately reveals such deep wounds from the right, concerns that the judiciary for so long has itself been overreaching and activist, and not to mention going back to see how slim majorities, both in terms of the Hitnatkut as well as the Oslo, bulldozed ahead, and it just brings out so many things. Not to mention the Sephardim and the whole ethnic genie. And then on the left, the concerns, as Ambassador Regev has said, of this is genuinely people on the left feel that this is swapping the tyranny that the right see of the left to the other foot with what de Tocqueville famously has called the tyranny of the majority. It's going to just allow the elected officials to do whatever they want, and that it's fighting for the soul of Israel to the extent of doing the very controversial things of even bringing, as I said, the army and economy into the political fray. So these are some real issues which go very, very deep, and I think it's brought out all types of concerns, of fears from both sides. As Ambassador Regev said, there's no doubt that the vast majority of Israelis believe there has to be some type of judicial change. The shoe has been on the other foot for too long, and it's just how the way it is, the judges and an army of legal advisors can almost curtail and overrule any and every political initiative, which doesn't often reflect the majority of how Israel votes. And getting this balance right is absolutely critical. And I think the only way one can have long-term changes is in an evolutionary way. Revolutions don't tend to work very well. I think Aaron Barak was very smart. He did a major revolution very quietly in an evolutionary way. I think on the 3rd of January, when Yariv Levin announced his revolution, you can't announce revolutions. The French Revolution caused the death of 17,000 people, guillotined. The only way, Rahman al-Islam, to succeed in revolutions is to steamroll and to revolutionize. The Jewish way is what I believe is a revolutionary spirit in an evolutionary way. And there has to be trust, and there has to be deep unity for it to be evolutionary and to be sustainable. And I think that's the challenge. I think we know that the current government in Israel is the most right-wing and religious government ever. And I think if one looks objectively, yes, the right-wing and religious won the vote fair and square and have a 64 majority, but every party knows that it's got Bibi right where they want him, and every party's been overreaching, everyone. If you look at every single party, they're going for broke. The Haredim want to institutionalize in law certain things of, not going to the army in a way that's never been done until now, yet they're a growing demography. So to give the blanket heter, maybe now the army doesn't need them. What about in 20, 30 years' time when it's enshrined in law that they don't have to serve? Secondly, we know that Shas has got billions of shekels for these welfare handouts tailor-made to the size of the families in the Shas community. We know the Religious Zionist Party has also wanting to legalize every controversial settlement and take part of the Ministry of Defense under Smotrich's control. Ben Gvir wants his own private, police force with extended authority. Now, all these things alone, maybe, you put all that together, and you've got many in Israel very frightened. And on top of that, you say, and guess what, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now we're going to unleash the judicial reform. This has galvanized not only the people on the left who have been, the hard left, who've been campaigning against Bibi for years, the Prime Minister outside our office half the days for years haven't been able to drive out because the black flags have been trying to get Bibi out for years as the Prime Minister. But it wasn't only the hard left, it galvanized so many people. When I see people like Yossi Klein Halevi and Daniel Gordis, who people I deeply respect and read their works, so alarmed and so frightened and so scared and talking in an apocalyptic way that they never have, we have a real issue. And I think the only way to address it is to say, yes, the right has the right to do this, and yes, judicial reform has to be, but we have to do it in a way where it's consensual, in a way that it's got broader acceptance. Otherwise, it ain't looking good.
Thank you. Ambassador Regev, you spoke about what's going on within Israel. Maybe you could explain to us a little bit about the impact that judicial reform is having, over the world, and how it's continuing to impact Israel's relations with Western countries, and particularly the US.
So, I'm a bit of a cynic on this issue. I think if Israel was taking down settlements and moving to establish a Palestinian state, I don't think Joe Biden would have a huge problem with judicial reform. Why do I say such an outrageous thing? Because I saw him just a few months ago meet the Turkish leader and have a very good meeting. And I don't think President Erdogan in Ankara is particularly known for his sticking up for judicial independence. And I saw President Biden meet the Polish Prime Minister. Hugs and kisses. Now, the demonstrators in the streets of Israel who say this is the end of democracy, what do they say? They say, Bibi wants to make us Poland. I think it's politics. And I think Biden doesn't like this government. I think Biden would have preferred that Yair Lapid would have won the election. That's not new. We know that Clinton campaigned for Perez against Netanyahu. Not a surprise. We know what it was like with the Obama administration. This is hardball politics. That's what it's all about. You could criticize Netanyahu and say he's given the administration, something to hit him over the head with. He shouldn't have given it to them, right? That's a real politique argument that I think you can have a serious discussion on that. But to say that he's morally outraged about judicial reform in Israel, that's a bridge too far for Regev.
The Dati Leumi community in Israel is divided not just on the question of judicial reform, but also regarding the political party, Hatzionut Hadatit, the religious Zionist party led by Chaver Knesset Bezalel Smotrich. Looking at some of the statistics from the last election, in some religious Zionist communities, places like Efrat and Alon Shvut, where we were living, fully fledged, Dati Leumi communities, only 48% voted for Hatzionut Hadatit in partnership with Otzma Yehudit. Yet if you look in Nof Ayalon, 68%, in Eli, 75%, Kochav HaShachar, 86% voted for Hatzionut Hadatit. So in your experience, how much does Hatzionut Hadatit really represent Hatzionut Hadatit? And also Rav Perez, I think a lot of people would like to know, World Mizrachi, as the global religious Zionist organization, what is World Mizrachi's position on the party Hatzionut Hadatit?
Thank you for the easy, simple question.
You were warned.
Just to say as follows. The Dati Leumi community in Israel is, like around the world, is not a homogeneous community. It's very heterogeneous. It's very broad. And Dati Leumi representatives are in almost every party. Almost every party. In fact, we're taking a delegation of members of parliament from across the Dati Leumi world, from Yesh Atid through to Tzionut Datit, on a certain trip where we try to work with all of them. So it's not heterogeneous, it's not homogeneous, number one. Number two, I think the religious Zionist world in Israel has become a product of its own success. It's even doubting, does it even need its own party? Meaning, maybe we're so involved in Israeli society that essentially we're involved in all the parties, so maybe you don't even need a party. So you've even got that argument to say, we don't need a party. And I think the biggest thing for me which has changed, which relates to both of your questions, is that until 10 years ago, World Mizrachi did have an affiliate political party. 11 years ago, it was called Mafdal, the National Religious Party, which changed its name to Beit Yehudi. And then when Naftali Bennett became the head of Beit Yehudi in 2013, he changed its constitution to say Miyesoda Shel Mafdal, no longer the Mafdal, originally the Mafdal. And at that point, I think World Mizrachi became free politically, for good or for bad. World Mizrachi is no longer, there's no Mafdal, there's no National Religious Party, and even the Jewish Home, which was pretty much the Mafdal and brought together all the different parts of the three different parties. It was Ichud Lomi, it was Beit Yehudi, it was Yamina, and that actually, which became Yamin Chadash, became Yamina, that's basically broken up. And those who follow Israeli politics know that the Tzionut Datit party of today is essentially the National Union, the Ichud Lomi party, Tkuma before, from years ago. So I think the great challenge we have as the national religious movement in Israel, we don't actually have the old Mafdal. There isn't one party which brings together everyone. Not brings together everyone, but like what's called mainstream religious Zionist. And that's a challenge. Now, you talk about Efrat 50% voting for the National Religious Party. It's interesting that so many people that I know, they did a poll before the last election, and they showed that people who voted for the traditional Mafdal voters or voted for the united Beit Yehudi, Yamina, Yamin Chadash, etc., there was now no more Beit Yehudi. So they said 1/3 said they would vote for the Religious Zionist Party, 1/3 for Likud, and 1/3 for either Benny Gantz's party or left. It basically splintered. And that's really what's happened. And I think for Mizrachi, because obviously the religious Zionist party of Bezalel Smotrich is more to the, let's call it the right, politically and religiously, of the religious Zionist world. And many people who voted for it, some people because they absolutely believe in it, and other people, they said, well, it's the only religious Zionist party. Even though it's the only one which it's gone further to the right, it's the only party in Israel today which once claims to be a religious Zionist party, even if it's not uniting everyone. Ben Gvir, I must say, is not that. Ben Gvir has never said that Otzma Yehudit is trying to be a religious Zionist party. He has non-religious members. He has about 50%, according to the polls, were not religious. He's specifically not trying to galvanize the religious Zionist world. He's like it's a hard right party which was technically linked in the elections to the Tzionut Datit, but not today, and was never sort of fully ideologically aligned. World Mizrachi, we have a challenge. On the one hand, we are independent, and we want to be a unifying force, and we don't have a formal political affiliation like we had with the Mafdal. On the other hand, and Ambassador Regev will know this more than most, it's hard to operate in Israel if you don't have a political affiliation. The whole thing's built into politics. So we walk a very fine line of working with the establishment and the establishment religious Zionist party, because there's only one which claims to be and wants to be religious Zionist, but at the same time maintaining our independence. So it's a fine line to be unifying and to try capture what the Mafdal spirit was, while at the same time not being oblivious to the fact that there's a system in Israel and you need to know how to work with it while working together without formal official affiliation. And I think that's the great challenge.
I live in the Modi'in area, and I'm sure both of you know better than most. Modi'in attracts a lot of young Anglo-Saxon Olim, many of whom are my neighbors and friends. And there's some people said there's a guy who was the Minister for Religious Affairs in Bennett's government, Matan Kahana, who's a former Sayeret Matkalist, elite combat unit, and then he had enough of being in the commandos, and he became a combat fighter pilot, right? And a very serious man. And he was the Minister for Religious Affairs in Bennett's government. And he tried to do reforms on kashrut, and he tried to do reforms on conversion, and the Haredim went bananas, right? And the minute this government came in, all of his reforms were thrown out. The sort of religious people I see in Modi'in, which maybe tend to be more on the moderate side, and maybe other people are going other places, yeah? But I know people who voted for blue and white, for Benny Gantz, only because Matan Kahana was there. And there's a tzibur there, there's a forum there of people who grew up in Bnei Akiva, yeah? Who went to schools like Yavne, who say, this is religious Zionism, and he's not in a religious Zionist party. He used to be, because he used to be with Bennett, but no longer.
I just wanted to say on that, that's why I was saying, probably a third of those who would have voted for Beit Yehudi have now voted for Benny Gantz's party, because it has people like Chili Tropper, who's religious Zionist. It has people like Matan Kahana, who's religious Zionist. It has Gidon Sa'ar, who is not a card-carrying religious Zionist member, but he's Shomrei Shabbat. He has what they call in Israel the invisible kippah. It also has there's others there as well. And therefore, there are, even though, let's say, Gantz's party is not a religious Zionist party, and neither is the Likud, but both have strong components of religious Zionist representation. That's why I said, I reckon they say, Begadol, a third went religious Zionist party, a third Likud, and a third to Benny Gantz's party.
Jews in the diaspora, always looking towards Israel and wanting to comment and respond to things that they see happening in Eretz HaKodesh. Last month, after the passing of the, depends how you call it, either the Bitul or the Tzimtzum, Chok HaSvirut, the limitation on the reasonability, the reasonableness standard, several Jewish organizations across the world, including in Australia, released public statements expressing concern and criticizing the move. On the one hand, we read on Shabbat, Lo tireh et shoachicho et seyo nidachim v'italamta mehem. That if somebody sees their brother's affairs, nidachim, going far off, far afield, many feel a sense of duty to get involved. Yet others feel that such statements, criticizing Israeli policy on the international stage, are really a bit of an own goal in terms of increasing anti-Semitism and the other risks therein. What are your thoughts on Jewish roof bodies in the diaspora making public statements criticizing Israeli foreign or Israeli domestic policy?
Always defer first to the ambassador.
So listen, you can't shut Jews up, right? They're going to say what they want to say, and everyone has an opinion, okay? I wasn't here when Ariel Sharon pulled out of Gaza, but I'm sure there were some people in Mizrachi who weren't happy. Correct, Annie? Yes? And they probably said that they weren't happy. When I was ambassador in London, I used to say two things, okay? Have your opinions. Everyone can have their opinions. Having an opinion is like being involved, right? You can't love the country and not have an opinion, okay? So everyone's got an opinion. Everyone in this room has an opinion. But I always said, be conscious of two things. Number one, Israel's a democracy and the Israeli people are voting, and at least have some respect of the right of the Israeli people to make their own decisions. And you can't sit here in Melbourne and say they're all wrong, they don't understand, only I here in Melbourne know what's right for the Israelis. There's something almost, what's the word? It's
Presumptuous, arrogant.
What's the word?
Presumptuous.
Presumptuous, good word, thank you. It's like, you know, a bit of sneot, yeah? You sit here in Melbourne and you know exactly what the Israelis need to do on the Palestinian issue, on religion. You've got all the answers and you sit here in Melbourne. I'm sorry. I used to go to, when I was in London, I'd go to a Reform synagogue to speak. Here as ambassador, I'd go to all synagogues, but I'd also go to a Reform synagogue, right? And they'd say, what's going on with Reform Jews and why does the rabbinate not go? I said, well, why don't you come to Israel and vote? Orthodox people are making aliyah, why aren't you making aliyah, right? You can have an influence. So there's something presumptuous, right, about someone who sits in the diaspora. Some of them are my friends. And they tell the Israelis, if only you listen to me, everything would be fine. It's presumptuous. The second thing I say to diaspora Jews, and once again, I started by saying everyone's entitled to your opinion and I respect your opinion and, you know, it's part of caring. But you said it, Rabbi, in your remarks, you've got to be very careful not to play into the hands of Israel's enemies. When I was in England, I can say it now, I'm no longer the ambassador, the British Foreign Office is not traditionally a great friend of Israel, right? It's full of people who used to be called Arabists. I don't know what you call them today because the Arabs are making peace with Israel. But people who are not specifically, you know, in their gut pro-Israel, right? And if a Jewish organization, you know, talks about settlements or something they don't like, who are they helping? In the British political context, they're helping people. So I'm always, if you're going to talk about politics, always think about how your remarks will play and who are you helping? And I think to ask people to think through things. I've made 2 points. One, the presumptuous point, that people should respect the Israeli democratic process and the right of the Israeli people to make. And look, I grew up in Hambonim, I said it before, I'll say it again. Begin was prime minister at the time, wrongly, I admit it now. I weighed on Aliyah and I said, I'm going to vote Begin out of office, right? If you care that much that you want to do that, make Aliyah and make yourself, right? If you're in the diaspora, I think a bit of presumption. And also think politically about what your comments will affect and how will they play out. And having said both those things, I know Jews will say what they want to say anyway.
I'll just maybe add one small point just on what Ambassador Regev said about the second point about, you know, we don't live in, you know, we live with, you know, we don't live in echo chambers as much as sometimes we do. Whatever we do, people hear. And I think we have to be very careful about, as the Ambassador said, about the implications of what we say. I think we've lost something that Ben Gurion used to call mamlachtiyut. It's difficult. If you are a partisan party and you want to express, that's one thing. But if you represent an umbrella body of it's one thing Mizrachi in Melbourne saying something, and even that, they're diverse views. But it's an umbrella organization of the religious Zionist institutions. It's not the umbrella organization of Australian Jewry. If you are that, you have to be very, very mindful to try as much as possible to be supportive of the state of Israel and to be very mindful of criticizing the government, especially when it's done in an acerbic way, which I think feeds, you know, the enemy. So, well, look, the Jews themselves say that you're not a democracy anymore and that you're racists and you're this and you're that and you're all of these things. So I think we have to be very mindful of being as broad as possible and not playing into partisan politics.
Thank you. Army service, Sherut Tzvai, is a core part of Israeli society. The sense of duty, but also the sense of privilege after Alpayim Shnot Galut, 2,000 years of exile, to be able to serve in an army is truly a privilege. Many young people, including myself, esteemed members of this panel, made Aliyah Dafka at a younger age in order to be able to serve in the army and thereby integrate, as well as to give to Israeli society. And yet, as we know, most Haredim, a large sector of Israeli society, on the whole, do not serve in the IDF. This has become a point of tension over the years, and perhaps even more exacerbated recently by the large Haredi representation in the current government. And whilst the Haredi brothers and sisters share full rights and benefits from the state, most of them do not serve in Sahel. What are your views on the question of Haredim and army service, and what are the possible solutions?
Since this one is less of an ambassadorial nature, maybe it is. I'll just make one or two brief comments. It's true the army today does not need the en masse Haredi conscription. It's true. The question is what's going to be in 10, 20, 30 and 40 years' time. We so often do things to solve short-term problems and we don't think of the long-term consequences. We all know Ezu Chacham, it says in the Gemara, Haro'eh Tanolad. A true Chochem is a person who sees with foresight the Haredi demography is growing in leaps and bounds, Baruch Hashem, in Israel. And therefore, what happens in the coming decades is going to have a deep impact on demography and what happens in Israel. So to give, I think everybody agrees, even many on the left agree that there should be outstanding Torah learners absolved of military responsibility because we need a cadre of every year thousands of top Torah learners. I think there would be national consensus on that. Does that mean that every single person of a particular community should be absolved in law, not only deferred but absolved? And I think that it's not a challenge now, and it may very well be one in the years to come. And it's a challenge. We have to be mindful of that because I think, again, every party is trying to solve its problems for now. But I think there has to be a mindfulness of the long-term mamlachti consequences of such decisions.
My wife once said to me, and sometimes she says things that are very important, she said to me, why are my kids going into the army and your kids who live in Australia are not? We said before about presumptuous, right? Australian Jews sit here, and except for the Chayalim who come on Israel, who I respect, your kids don't go to the army, unless they've been in Bnei Akiva and they go in Aliyah and they go in the army, right? So that's a bit of sniut. First point. Second point. I think all Israelis should do the army. That's my moral position. But it's not going to happen. First of all, about 20% of the Israeli population is Israeli Arabs. And except for the Druze and the Cherkessim, how do you say that in English? Caesarean, no, that's how you give birth. I don't remember how, but the Cherkessim do the army service too, but most Israeli Arabs don't. And most of us are pretty happy that they don't, right? There's not a huge, big popular demand. So I think the Haredim are wrong, right? They're wrong on all sorts of things and they're wrong about army service. But in a real political world, it's not going to happen. That's the reality. It goes back to Ben Gurion's decision to give the P'tur when the state was established because he wanted the support of Agudat Israel on the establishment of the state, right? That's the truth. Now, I believe that if you put pressure on the Haredi community, they just circle the wagons, like in the famous Westerns, and they become more internal looking. And I think that's a mistake. You've got to try to influence them with love, you've got to try to influence them with outreach, you've got to try to encourage them to integrate into the state. And I think carrots are better than sticks. As an Israeli, the issue of Haredi not going to the army bothers me. Of course it bothers me. But what bothers me more is the workforce issue. That they're not in the economy. And they're not contributing the same way the rest of the population is. And that's keeping Israel, if you've got, 15% of the population who is underrepresented in the workforce, that's a national asset that, I'm poorer. The country's poorer because of that. And I think that's where the focus should be. In all politics, there are a million things I'd like to do, but I've got to say, what are the 10 things that I can do and make a difference? Because if I try to do a million things, I'm not going to get anything done, right? I'd like to see the Haredim in the army, but that's not my priority today. I say this is a secular Israeli. My priority today is, can we get more Haredim into education, workforce education, and get them that they can support themselves and not living off state funding? And unfortunately, The current legal structure is the only way you get a ptor from the army is to be in yeshiva, and if you go to work, they'll arrest you for being a draft dodger. What's the point? I mean, we understand the logic, but it's counterproductive in the extreme. So if we can make legal changes that maybe encourage Haredim to work and don't arrest them because the minute they get out of the yeshiva, right? I mean, the people who want to study in yeshiva, they study in yeshiva, but there are a lot of people in yeshiva because they're trapped in yeshiva, because if they don't study, they have to go to the army. And so I think there is room for the best, for the country to find solutions that aren't perfect. You know, there's no perfect solutions in this world, right? But to find solutions that can work. And my priority today, encourage Haredim to go to the army. Give them all sorts of carrots to go to the army. The people who do go to the army, especially Chayalim Bodedim, and there are from Australia, I meet them, right? They give them all the carrots. They should get all the encouragement. They should get all the support, right? Because it's a mitzvah. It's the best, right? With the Haredi community, I think the process should be on education and getting them into the workforce, because that's the big issue. That's the big issue. Because as you say correctly, Rabbi, they're going to become a bigger part of the country. Their demography is growing, and that means the less productive part of Israel is going to become bigger, and that's not good for anyone.
I agree wholeheartedly with everything the ambassador said.
Thank you. Thank you.
There's a scholar of Haredi life called Dr. or Professor Neri Horowitz. Have you heard of him? This guy talks exactly like you do. He talks about the need to work with the Haredi community because it will bring positive results. And before I invite a couple of questions from the audience, one of our earlier Olim, by the way, there are plenty of people here whose kids have served in the army.
I see.
Yep, I just want to stress the point when you go back. Dr. Gary Zettner's son-in-law was an aspiring leader in Sayeret Matkal, and one day his commander came to him and said, "You're being transferred." And he said, "Okay, where am I going?" He said, "You're going to be the head of Nachal Haredi, the Haredi unit." And he said, "I'm not going." So he said, "You've got a choice. You either go or you're dismissed from the army." So he went. And Ron Weiser and I spent some time in the Aza area at some stage, and he was escorting us because he was now the head of that whole area. He said it was the best 3 years in his army life. Every member of that Nachal Haredi unit was a volunteer, and they were tremendously committed. Afterwards, he went with a whole new respect. This is a guy with the gigantic kippah ruga. We're talking a serious Talmud Chacham. So there's lots to learn. A couple of questions from the audience. Gary Hertz.
Ambassador, we know you're a career diplomat, and we've heard you're a good Hubbo boy. How does a good Hubbo boy work with a good Beitar boy? Was the Hubbo boy ever conflicted, and if so, when? And did the Hubbo boy ever modify some of his statements when he spoke to the media? And what is the Hubbo boy now today?
You're asking a personal question. Yeah, that's all right. Well, the truth is, when I was in high school, I had a girlfriend from Bnei Akiva, so maybe she influenced me, I don't know. But I actually think, first of all, of course, I've changed. I grew up in Habonim, and then other things happened, and so forth and so on. But there's a famous meeting between Ben-Gurion and Jabotinsky in the early 1930s, where they actually make an agreement to work together. And it's called the Ben-Gurion-Jabotinsky deal, right? And then it goes to the Histadrut, and it's voted down by the members, right? But there's no doubt that Ben-Gurion wanted to work He didn't like the idea that Jabotinsky was out there doing something by himself. He wanted to bring him into the tent, and he thought there was a strong enough national thing. Now, if you know your Israeli political history, as I know this guy does, you know that actually the Likud was founded by Cherut, Liberalim, and a third group called La'am. And the La'am were the Rafi people who refused to go back to labor, and they ended up joining the Likud. And so a lot of these differences are, how did a Habo boy end up working for Netanyahu? By accident. I was in the foreign ministry, and in the foreign ministry it's like being in the army, right? Your job is to represent the elected government of Israel, right? And if you can't accept those rules, then you can't work for the public service, right? If you're working as an Israeli diplomat abroad, your job is to represent the elected government of the state of Israel. And I was doing that for many years, and then they asked me to Olmert. He had a spokesperson for the international media called Miri Eisen. Maybe some of you remember. She was a colonel in the IDF. She had to leave for personal reasons, and Olmert said, you have to bring someone in. And I came in for Olmert's last year, right? And Netanyahu gets elected, and I start cleaning out my desk, right? I thought, because it's a Misrati Mun, it's not a civil service position, the one I had. It's the Prime Minister's choice. The Prime Minister gets to choose his advisors, right? And then I got this phone call during the transition period, and this is how it works in the serious world of politics. I was asked by someone who's now my close friend, but I didn't know at the time, said, Mark, if the Prime Minister-elect asked you to stay, would you? Because they don't want him to ask you to stay and you say no. That's terrible, right? And I don't know why, maybe because I like the job so much, I agreed and ended up working more than 10 years with Netanyahu. And respect him, and even like him. Not that it's like living with a woman, yes, or with anyone. You see the warts, you see all the faults, but what is a good marriage? That after 40 years you can look at your partner and see all the deficiencies and still love them, correct? So it's not like that between me and Netanyahu, but I've seen him close up, and I can still respect the man, and I see someone who's got greatness, all right? Has he passed it? Should he have resigned? That's a whole separate issue, right? But there's no doubt that he's a serious player, right? And I remember I was working for him in my late 50s, early 60s. And how many people have a job where you learn something new every day, right? And when you're playing at that league of politics, right, it's for someone like me who was always interested in politics. I don't know about Yavna, Danny, but when I was at Mount Scopus doing matric, they didn't offer politics at the school. And I went to Melbourne High in the evening to do politics in matric because I was always a political animal, as the friends who were with me and remember me from my high school years. And so for me, it was like, I also think, that let's be fair. If you look at Israel's success, okay, over the last couple of decades, and there's no doubt that Israel's an amazing success story, right? If we didn't have this judicial reform thing now, everyone, the Israeli economy, the Israeli demographic, Israel's on a positive trajectory. A lot of the recent affluence in Israel is because of the liberal market reforms that Netanyahu pushed through, right? And he deserves respect for that. If Israelis today are going on holidays abroad and are affluent, and you see them all over the world, and a lot of that is because of he opened up what used to be a very sort of socialistic system, and he opened it all up. He deserves credit for that.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call on Dr. Michael Kaufman to express a vote of thanks. I didn't express it enough before, but Rav Johnny did. Dr. Michael, will you join us? Dr. Michael has managed the Midrash and has done a fantastic job, so it's a pleasure to call upon her now.
I just very briefly wanted to mention that we have Midrash, and we also have not Midrash, who come, and this year we're going to have 2 girls join us, as well as Bahurei is there, and we're very, very proud, not only of the work that we do in the Midrash, but we're also enormously proud of the number of women who come regularly to Shurim and take an active part. So I want to actually say a big thank you to, and I see so many of you here tonight, I really want to thank all of you for your contribution to our Beit Midrash. So thank you. Benji and I are going to give a vote of thanks. I want to start with you, Ambassador Regev. Actually, I want to tell you a secret with all of these people here. I first came across you when I was head of Jewish Studies at Mount Scopus, because one of my students told me my uncle is the ambassador. So, and it was one of the Golvans. So I have kind of been following you ever since, and I want to thank you tonight for your outstanding comments, your insights, your optimism. I certainly know that, saying, we've really walked away feeling that there's a lot of hope, and your insights, your optimism is the mamash medabek. So thank you very much on behalf of everybody here. Rabbi Peretz, I think for me and for everybody here, what you bring to us is in Mizrachi that we belong to something very big. Mizrachi magazine makes us all feel connected. And I know that I've had the privilege of writing a few articles in the magazine as well. And I think that idea that we are connected through your organization to something in Eretz Israel and something so big is such a credit to you. Rabbanit Shani Tarragon has been here. So many people have come through World Mizrachi and have made a difference to our community. And I not only want to, on behalf of everybody here, thank you just for the presentation, but for everything that you do for our community. And once again, your comments, like the ambassadors, has been so meratek and meragesh, and really have uplifted our spirits. So thank you very much.
Good. I know the hour is late, so I'll be quick just to sum up the evening. Thank you all for your attendance here. It's been a wonderful 25th anniversary Beit Midrash and Midrashah event. On behalf of the Mizrachi executive and the committee, I offer my hakarat hatov for your ongoing commitment and support towards Torah learning. In his commentary on this week's parasha, Ki Tavo, Rabbi Jonathan Zaks, Zichrono Livracha, emphasizes the centrality of education. He highlights how the commandments to inscribe the Torah on stones reflects the Jewish tradition's understanding of the enduring power of education. He notes that the act of writing the Torah on stones signifies the need for a tangible and lasting embodiment of knowledge. Rabbi Sachs draws a parallel between the inscribed stones and the luchot containing the Aseret HaDibrot. Just as those tablets represented the covenant between Hashem and Bnei Israel, the stones in this parasha symbolize the covenant of education, the commitment to passing down knowledge, values and tradition to the next generation. The commandment to write the Torah on stones teaches us that education is the foundation upon which the Jewish people's continuity is built. Just as the stones were set up in the public place, education should be accessible and visible to all, reminding everyone of their shared heritage and values. And this, I feel, is what the founders of our wonderful Beit Midrash and Midrashah were thinking all those years ago, when they had the vision to establish a place of learning at 81 Balaclava Road, open for everyone in our community to use. And this, as we all know, has been primarily due to Danny Lamb, and it has been able to continue year after year by taking on the significant fundraising component needed to keep it running. Having just eased out of the Yavna Foundation chair position for for over a decade, I know firsthand how challenging fundraising can be. Phone calls get screened, People cross the road when they see you coming closer and will try hard not to make eye contact with you or engage in conversation. So Danny, on behalf of the Mizrachi organisation, I say thank you and give you the bracha from the famous words we say in the Shabbat Musaf Tefillah, V'chol mish oskim b'tzarchei tibur be'emunah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu yishalem zecharam, serving as a reminder that active involvement in the needs of the community, coupled with faith, is the cornerstone of maintaining a strong, supportive and spiritually enriching communal environment. Please come up to accept a small gift of our appreciation. Small gift. Which is inscribed, presented to Dr. Danny Lamb AM in recognition of your tireless years of dedication and fundraising towards the Mizrachi Beit Midrash. Thank you, Danny. That brings an end to this evening. However, we will be davening Mariv for those who would like to. Rav Doron Perez will be selling copies of his book for those who would like to purchase it, and signing them as well. Thank you, Danny. And there will be a lovely supper served outside. Thank you for your attendance. Have a good evening.
Just one final thing. Shkoyach Benji, wish you and the new executive and the committee every success. The gifts that our guests received were challah decals made by Monique Tawil, Michelle Tawil, and they have a particularly Australian style. So, nutz Gesundheit.